So welcome to Sabbath School. I don't think there's any such thing as preliminaries in my vocab at least, because it's all part of how we come and how we worship. So there's no pre-worship, there's just worship. And what we're doing here, what I want to share here is actually a little bit related to this. So see this? I've got my Indigenous tie on today. Hence the reason why I'm wearing, long sleeves and so on. Occasionally dress up because I just want to do this, but particularly because just yesterday marked 30 years since what? Since Mabo. Yes, since the great decision that actually recognised that terra nullius actually wasn't a thing. That the language that we might use for Aboriginal people to say that they just wander and go walkabout is actually not true. What they actually do, what we called it walkabout, but for them it's actually they're just walking around their country. They're checking out their estate, checking out their farm as it were, and they just have different sleeping arrangements on their farm as they move around their property is kind of how it is. So to call it terra nullius wasn't right, and they finally got it right, that the land was inhabited. So anyway, I just want to do an acknowledgement of country. Do you know what tribe that we're currently sitting on? Oh, you need to drive up the freeway a little more and you need to try and get that word in your brain, right? Darkinjung is the tribe in which we are. So I just want to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. And I want to acknowledge that any others from either to the south of us, the Ringai or the Ku-ring-gai people, or to the north of us, the Awabakal people who may be here or listening in. Just want to acknowledge them. And I want to acknowledge that they've been the custodians of this land, carrying on the duty of what Christ gave us in the garden in the beginning, to tend and to keep the earth and to look after it. A number of years ago, there was a statement, you don't worry about trying to read the writing of that, but you can look it up. It's called the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And there's an album that Midnight Oil, I don't expect any of you to be listening to Midnight Oil, but if you wanted to listen to something that might raise your eyebrows, this is not a bad soundtrack to listen to. It brought tears to my eyes when I listened to it. And at the heart of this Uluru Statement is this concept of makarata. It's the coming together after a conflict. I don't know whether I would be as generous, honestly, as the Aboriginal people are. But what I see and what I hear from their leadership is, yes, they've got the really angry part of the mob, but the leadership generally is they just want to make it work. And I'm so glad that our current government now is actually willing to actually say, all right, let's look at constitutional reform to acknowledge our First Nations people. Well, lest you think I'm going to talk about politics, I'm not. I want to talk about Aboriginal missionary work here in Australia as part of our Sabbath School time this morning. So, in 1788, there was an estimated, because no one counted it, it was too difficult to count, but there was an estimated between 750,000 and 1.25 million Aboriginal people in Australia. But a Flinders University study that's just recently been done estimated that that number could have been as high as 6.5 million, including Tasmania and Papua New Guinea as one landmass. So no one's really entirely sure how many there were, but there's substantially more than exists today. In 1930, we actually counted them for the first time, and there were 60,000 of them estimated. And in 2016 census, there's 798,000 of them. And only 1% are now considered pure blood. And you're like, well, how did that happen? It happened because successive government policy that our church participated in actually, as part of the missions that were run, were looking at how we could actually basically either eliminate, as in murder or kill, with smallpox parties or whatever was going on, or through assimilation. So there was a very strong assimilation program, and then of course there was the frontier wars that continued on as well. So it really brought the numbers down, and then we really just worked hard at really changing the nature of the landscape. So that, and in terms of the number of tribes or nations in Australia, there's more than 500 nations in Australia, of which there's 70 in New South Wales. And in our conference where we find ourselves, there's 23 different nations. So let that sink in a little bit. And here it is. Matthew 24 says this, and this gospel of the kingdom will be what? Preached in where? All the world, as a witness to who? To all what? All nations, right? So we've got to remember that, all nations. And then this, it's like, Matthew 28, and Jesus said to them, he said that all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me, therefore go and make disciples of who? All nations, right? And then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to proclaim to those who dwell on the earth, to every what? To every nation, to every tribe, language, and people. So after 100 years of mission, now I've gathered this data off our South Pacific Division from wherever sources that I could actually find the data. And this is what I've been able to figure out. In the Australian Union Conference, we've got 112 different church companies. We've got 434 churches. We've got 62,838 members. This is of a couple of years ago. And we've got 304 ordained pastors and 36 licensed ministers. And we've got 2 Adventists for every 1,000 people in the community, or a ratio of 1 to 500. Then in Papua New Guinea, wow, now look at the difference there in Papua New Guinea. We've got 3,207 church companies, 1,071 churches, 355,000 members. There's 221 ordained pastors. And what I must say about those in Papua New Guinea is the vast majority of those are indigenous. And then there's 488 licensed ministers, and the ratio there is 40 per 1,000, which is like substantially different. It's a lot higher. And then Trans-Pacific Union, so that, where's the Trans-Pacific Union? That takes in Fiji and a whole host of other islands. And they've got, we don't know how many companies, that data wasn't available, but they've got 459 churches, 211,000 members, 149 ordained pastors, 133 licensed pastors, for a ratio of 1 to 100, for 112 per 1,000. It's like, wow. So looking at those figures, you'd have to say, where has the success been? In the islands, right? In 100 years of island missionary endeavour, we've been hugely successful. Now, the number of ordained Indigenous pastors in Australia is less than 20. If we take in, even since we started here in Australia, it's still less than 20. In fact, I think the figure is close to 11, maybe 12 now, somewhere around that sort of range. It's a very small number. And in missions in Australia, we started the first missionary work to Aboriginal people in Australia was started here in North New South Wales Conference at Burnt Bridge, and Pastor, what's his name? Rudge, I think it was. Moved in there, and he actually went a little further up than where the one that you may remember if you've ever been up that way at Bellbrook. He went a little bit further up and started there. And the mission work went on for about 4 or 5 years and eventually closed down. But it was hugely successful. And he wrote several letters to the leaders of the church saying, hey, the way that we're obliged to do this mission work isn't working. We need to do things differently. We need to do things how we're doing them in Papua New Guinea and other places of the world, which is we need to do it the Adventist way, not the government mandated way. But we continued on doing the government mandated thing. And you can read about that in various sources. But there's lots of others. We've had Mona Mona. Mona Mona actually made the news, national news, in 2014 on SBS at least, for its involvement in stolen generations. That's a sad part of our church history. Karalundi, Wiluna, Melawa, Mirrawinni Gardens, Kurrawa, Mamaratha College. One of the sad things about so much of the mission work that went on is that they eventually closed. And the question is, why did they close? That's a good question to consider. So here, Aboriginal nations, languages in New South Wales. This is a map. Yeah, it just looks like a nice colouring in. You know, this is what I would call colouring in number one. If you do geography, this is kind of what it is. And there's all of these different tribes. And what I want you to notice is that if you draw a line straight through the middle, there's 23 tribes above that. And they represent all the different nations in our conference. And all those nations, they all speak different languages or slightly different languages. So, in Australia, there's like 798,000 Aboriginals. We've got 265,000 in New South Wales. There's 5,500 approximately in Newcastle. On the Central Coast, there's 12,500 Aboriginals. In Lake Macquarie, there's 8,000. And in the Hunter, there's 15, which means between the Hunter right through to the Central Coast here, there's more than 30,000 Aboriginals living in the community. And then there's this, in Newcastle. So this is just looking at the stats for Newcastle from the 2016 census figures. There's 500 Spanish people living in Newcastle. We've got a church for Spanish-speaking people. There's just under 2,000 Polish people living in Newcastle. We've got a church for the Polish people in Newcastle. There's 329 Samoan. Now, I'm not sure I believe that. I actually think there's more than that, but they're just not living in Newcastle. And we've got a Samoan church. Then, not sure how many Pacific Islanders, but we've got one of those as well. There's a Tongan group, and there's around 500 Koreans living around the university, and we've got a church for the Korean community at West Wallsend. And yet we've got 5,500 Aboriginal people in the Newcastle area, and we've only got one failed small group that was started only a couple of years ago. And it was attracting more Papua New Guineans than it was local Aboriginal people in Windale. And I look at that and my heart bleeds, and I'm just like, how is it that in 100 years of being here in our conference, we celebrated our 100th anniversary last year, that these people haven't even made it onto our radar? That somehow or rather we've just ignored their situation, and we've planted these Polish churches, we've planted Spanish-speaking churches, we've planted all these other churches. Somehow or rather they get on our agenda, they get our attention. And the Aboriginal people, just somehow or rather we've ignored them. So hence the reason why I love Indigenous things. I love being a troubler of the people. I love raising this as an issue because I actually think there's an injustice here. There's a prejudice here that we've bought into as part of the Australian story of our church. I'm not the only one saying this. You can read the encyclopedia you can read the Adventist encyclopedia and you can see what they've got to say in there around these issues. And how so much of our mission work failed for one main key reason: lack of funding. And I find that a really tragic thing. There are, this is just kind of a repeat, but in Australia there are 11 Aboriginal pastors. At one stage, and I'm not sure if it's still true, our conference had the most Aboriginal workers. So that was Keith Stockwell, it was Linnell DeTippo, And it was, they were our two Aboriginal workers. And then Quinton Dutlow, who's not Aboriginal but working in an Aboriginal community. So we had 3 people working in Aboriginal ministry in our conference. And that was the most. It's like, isn't that outrageous? Like, if we're serious about going to every nation, tribe, language, and people, then how is it that we've been so blind to this for so long, is the question I'm asking myself. Now, I haven't always asked this question. I had to go to New Zealand. I had to actually see the work among the Maori people in New Zealand. Then I had to get an awakening when I came back here. I had to go to an ATSIM tent meeting at Big Camp. And while I'm sitting there, I'm actually saying, is this all that represents the ministry in our conference for Aboriginal people? And I came home from that and I was sick for a few days. And while I'm sick, God's just working my heart saying, well, just look at the data, Neil. Read the data and see. So I'm reading the data, I'm looking, and I'm seeing all of this. This is where I produced this a number of years ago. And it's just like, all right, every chance I get then, I'm raising this as an issue. I've said to our executive, we need to do more. I've said to our evangelism director, I said, did you know that there's 30,000 Aboriginals living in the Hunter, Newcastle area? And he says, no, I had no idea. And so a few weeks later, I caught up with Matt again, and Matt said, wow, I didn't know. He said, I see them everywhere now. And I said, yeah, why aren't they on your agenda? Why don't we have targeted mission work trying to reach out to them? So here's the work. So in 1910, Pastor Philip Rudge went to the Macleay village at Burnt Bridge, and he started to work there. That work then closed down. It restarted again by Edward Rosendale, a retired minister, in 1967. And then that school closed down, so they started a boarding school there, and it closed down in 1970. It was restarted as Mirrawinny Gardens in the 70s, and I went with Hillview up there to do drive and build kind of work there. And then in 1975, we actually get our first Indigenous minister in Australia. So how long is that? That's like, well, if it started in 1910, that's 65 years later. Just notice that figure, 65 years to get our first one. He's not ordained until 1980, on the 12th of the 12th, 1980. It's like, wow, it takes a long time. Compare that to this. In the Wayback Valley of Western Highlands in 1948, we sent the first missionary to that place. Within 10 years, we had our first Indigenous person from that valley as a pastor. Within 20 years of that, he was ordained. It's like, wow, we know something about doing mission work in Papua New Guinea, and we somehow or rather haven't learnt the lessons of how to do that in Australia. Now, I'm not saying any of this to shame us or to trouble us, but why I'm saying this is because I actually think there's a gap here in the homeland that we need to address and we need to get onto. So this is his story, Pastor George Quinlan. He's an amazing guy. I didn't get to meet George, but I got to meet his wife. And it's his story. So today, Mirrawinny Gardens operated for more than 30 years. And then it was finally closed, like so many of them were, through lack of funding. Karawar started off after that. John Lang, he tried to get it going. God bless him. And that closed down. Why? Troubles of getting staff and all sorts of things, and financial problems as well. It's like finance seems to be such an important part of this. And here's an article that was written during the earliest years. So this is from our encyclopedia. Early years of mission endeavour in the South Pacific, little was done to reach out to Australia's Indigenous peoples. It has been suggested that many early Australian Adventists may have been conditioned by the prevailing climate of public opinion and had little sympathy or concern for the Indigenous population living on the fringes of towns or in the more remote parts of the continent. Rudge submitted frequent letters for the publication in the Australasian Record during the course of 1912. While his correspondence remained positive, he reported privately to superiors that many of the most serious hindrances to our present work will be removed when we're able to enter upon our own mission. We were compromised in our work because the government said, if you want to do mission work this way, this is what you have to do. We should have been willing to fight harder against the government like we did with the Constitution and religious liberty. We should have actually said, well, part of this means that we should be able to do mission our way on our terms. As a result, church leaders agree that if something of lasting significance was to be achieved, it needed to have its own mission operation based on its own unique holistic philosophy, addressing the physical, educational, and spiritual needs of the people it served. So this is Brewarrina. Keith Stockwell and Danuta Stockwell started a church plant there, and to this day, it's going great. Now that image there, I was out there doing a pastoral visit of our team a few years ago, and as I'm driving around in the back of the car with Keith and Danuta sees a lady, an Aboriginal lady, gets out of the car, goes up and is just literally talking over the fence. You can't see, but there's a fence between their bodies there. And Danuta just puts her arm around her after they've been chatting for a while and says, well, let me pray for you. And they just start praying. And I'm just like, yes, this is what a pastor should be doing. This is what ministry is all about. It was just fantastic. In Brewarrina, there was a very tragic funeral that took place of Joyce Dooley, Joycey. And Joycey was an amazing character. Now, the guy on the left was the chairman of Variety Australia. It's a charity, children's charity here in Australia. And he and Joyce started a program called Bush to Beach, where they would take Aboriginal kids from Brewarrina and they would put them on a bus and they would take them down to Sydney. In fact, as the story goes, Joycey wanted a bus. So she went to the local prison in Brewarrina. There's a prison just out of town where all the men are held. It's kind of like daycare for the men, you know. The women go home and the men, they're in the prison because, you know, things have gone wrong for them. So she went to the prison and said, look, I want a bus. And they said, you can't have it. And she says, no, I want a bus. And they said, no, you can't have it. We need it for the... No, you don't understand. I want a bus. I'm going to take the kids from Brewarrina to the beach in Sydney, and I want the bus. You're going to give me the bus. And, and then she said, all their fathers are here in the jail. You're going to give us the bus. So they said, all right. And then she said, you're going to give us the Caltex card as well. So she got the Caltex card, she got the bus, and she took the kids to the beach. Over the course of the next 10 plus years, it's still going to this day. Joyce is no longer with us, but it transformed the town. Joycey, who started by picking up kids on the street, taking them home, discovered that taking them home wasn't safe. She then took them to safe houses and started investing in the kids, got them in school, kept them in school, and said, if you stay in school, then we'll take you to the beach at Christmas. And this became such a fabulous transformation in the town that what started out as no kids finishing high school, suddenly all the kids going through school started finishing high school, with promises that they were going to go on and become doctors and they were going to come back and work among the people or teachers and so on. It's amazing transformation. In the heart of all of this, this lady, Joyce, actually starts Bible studies with Keith and Danuta. And it's through studies with her and her husband that the work really opens up in Brewarrina. And the Aboriginal people are beautiful people. They're deeply spiritual. They want to learn, they want to know, they want to grow. And they're kind and they're generous. And there's one of the young boys who actually had never really been to the beach before in his entire life, had the experience of going to the beach, learning how to surf, an amazing experience. I share these stories with you because I think the story is, it could be the most amazing experience. Imagine if we started engaging more with the Aboriginal people, what other great stories might actually happen. People say to me, they say, well, Neil, why don't you go and do that? Well, I think there's part of a problem now. We've got 100 years of abuse that's been injected, well, actually 250 years worth of abuse that's been injected on the Aboriginal people in Australia. And so the moment they see me, I'm the wrong skin colour. They're going to have prejudice. It's going to be harder for me. But it's not hard for all of us. We can actually engage in that space. I can engage in that space, but it's just not easy. There's a whole lot more barriers to get through. So I think at this point, what God really wants me to do is to raise awareness. To say, hey, there's this forgotten people group in our community, a whole nation within a nation here on the Central Coast, the Darkinjung people, to the south, the Ku-ring-gai people, to the north, the Awabakal people. Have we made contact with the elders? Do we want to meet with them on National Sorry Day or NAIDOC Week? Do we want to actually have that kind of dialogue with them? Maybe we could. Maybe we could start an influence. Maybe we can build some bridges, and from those bridges we can see the fruit and we can live out the obedience to the gospel commission, which is to go to every nation, tribe, language, tongue, and people. May God bless you as you think about this thing. It troubles my heart. I'm actually relieving my burden today by talking to you about it. And, I wear Indigenous shirts and Indigenous ties. Why? Because God's laid this burden on my heart to say, hey, we've got to do something. All right, let's pray. We'll get the guys to collect up the offering for our Sabbath schools now. And I just want to pray. Oh, they're in the classrooms. Thank you. Okay. All right, well, let me pray. Father, just thank you so much that we get to study your word. And I just pray that you'll bless us, you'll open our hearts to be receptive to your word today. We pray in your name. Amen.